Are we feeding poverty? Do you know? Food, fertilizers, mind material, and the development are interconnected? Do you know that impurities in food may pollute mind material and divide us? Hi friends, I am Dr. Rekha Kale, your success mindset mentor. Welcome once again to the mind material within us. In our previous episode, we asked, what are we feeding our mind? And we looked at the possible influence of our surroundings, habits and food on the creation and maintenance of our mind material. Today, I want to take this inquiry one step further. And this time, I want to ask a question that may make some of us uncomfortable. What if the material we use to build our bodies also influences the material with which our minds function? Think about it. A human being needs food to build and maintain the body. And the brain is also a physical organ. So naturally, nutrition matters for brain development and functioning. There is strong evidence that inadequate nutrition during childhood can affect brain development, cognitive abilities, educational achievement and, ultimately, earning potential. The World Bank has documented associations between childhood stunting, impaired cognitive and socio-emotional development, lower educational attainment and lower incomes later in life. So now let us look at the world around us. We hear a great deal about organic food, healthy food, balanced nutrition, fresh food, minimally processed food. But can everyone afford these choices? Not necessarily. The World Health Organization has pointed out that healthy diets can be inaccessible, particularly in low and middle-income countries. It estimates that billions of people around the world struggle to access safe, nutritious and sufficient food. And UNICEF has documented something even more disturbing. In many low and middle-income countries, families living in poverty may find nutritious foods considerably more expensive than calorie-dense staple or highly processed foods. When income is extremely limited, the priority can become, how do I fill the stomach? Rather than, how do I provide the most nutritionally diverse meal? UNICEF describes a vicious cycle in which income poverty and child food poverty can reinforce each other across generations. Now let us bring fertilizers and agricultural chemicals into the discussion. Here too, we need to be very careful. It would be scientifically incorrect to say, chemical fertilizer equals bad food. Fertilizers are not all the same, and inorganic fertilizers are not inherently poisonous simply because they are inorganic. In fact, fertilizers have played an important role in increasing agricultural productivity and food availability. FAO describes integrated nutrient management as combining organic and inorganic sources appropriately, rather than treating either one as the universal answer. And pesticides have also played a role in protecting crops and preventing losses, particularly where food shortages are serious. But there is another side. Some pesticides can be toxic. WHO says that older, less costly pesticides remain in use in some developing countries even though some have been banned elsewhere, and that agricultural workers who have direct exposure face the greatest risks. WHO and FAO also acknowledge that pesticide management remains a particular challenge in many low and middle-income countries where adoption of best practices has been slow. So the real question is not, are all chemicals bad? The better question is, who gets access to safe technology, safe food, good information and proper regulation, and who does not? Now let us come to junk food and ultra-processed food. Here the evidence becomes particularly interesting. WHO says that highly processed foods are increasingly available through global food systems and that many of these products are high in unhealthy fats, free sugars and salt. It also notes that aggressive marketing, urbanization and changing lifestyles have contributed to unhealthy dietary patterns. And there is an important economic dimension. UNICEF reports that in low-income settings, unhealthy ultra-processed foods can sometimes be among the more affordable and convenient choices available to families. So imagine a child growing up in such an environment. The family has limited income. Nutritious food is relatively expensive. Cheap, highly processed food is easily available. Advertising constantly creates desire for it. And the child develops eating habits around what is available and affordable. What happens next? The child may not receive the same nutritional opportunities as a child growing up in a household with greater resources. And this is where our mind material comes into the discussion. Because childhood is not merely a period in which the body grows. It is also a period in which the brain develops, experiences are accumulated, learning takes place and behavioral patterns are formed. So nutrition, education, stimulation, health and the environment can interact. And if poor nutrition contributes to impaired development, and impaired development contributes to poorer educational and economic outcomes, then we can begin to see something much bigger than an individual food choice. We can see a possible cycle. Poverty can influence food choices. Food choices can influence health and development. Development can influence educational opportunities. Education influences economic opportunities. And economic opportunities influence the next generation's ability to access nutritious food. And the cycle can repeat. This is not a theory of conspiracy. There is evidence for cycles of disadvantage. But now comes the provocative question. Is someone deliberately creating this cycle? Is there a centuries-old conspiracy by powerful countries or global leaders to deliberately keep developing countries underdeveloped? This is where our inquiry must become very disciplined. At present, I do not see credible evidence that proves such a single, coordinated centuries-long conspiracy. And I don't think we should present speculation as fact. But does that mean that there are no powerful economic interests influencing what people eat, what farmers produce and what food becomes easily available? Absolutely not. There is substantial evidence that commercial interests, food companies, marketing, trade, urbanization and food system structures influence food environments. UNICEF has specifically described how globalization and food trade have changed food availability, prices and marketing, and how food and beverage companies have expanded into low and middle income markets. WHO similarly identifies the availability, affordability and aggressive marketing of highly processed foods as important components of unhealthy food environments. So perhaps the more interesting question is not, who is secretly conspiring against us? Perhaps it is, what systems are creating the environment in which unhealthy choices become easier and healthy choices become harder? That is a much more useful question. And it brings us back to the mind material within us. Because suppose two children grow up in completely different food environments. One has access to diverse, nutritious food. The other grows up with mostly inexpensive, energy-dense, nutrient-poor food. Can we expect every aspect of their physical and mental development to be identical? Probably not. And suppose one child also receives good education, stimulating conversation, emotional security, healthcare and opportunities. The other experiences nutritional deprivation, poor healthcare, chronic stress and limited educational opportunities. Now we are no longer talking about food alone. We are talking about an entire ecosystem of human development. And that ecosystem can influence the material from which the future adult's mind is built. This is why I find the concept of mind material so fascinating. Because perhaps our mind material is not created only by one dramatic event. Perhaps it is created by thousands of small inputs. A meal, a conversation, a memory, a book, a stressful experience, a loving experience, a teacher, a parent, a neighborhood, a habit, a repeated thought, an opportunity, a deprivation, and perhaps even the quality of nutrition available during our developmental years. So should we become frightened? No. Should we start blaming farmers? No. Should we blame people who cannot afford organic food? Certainly not. Should we declare all chemical fertilizers dangerous? No. Should we accept every industrial food practice without question? Also no. We need inquiry, not fear. We need better agricultural practices, better regulation, better food safety, better nutrition education, better access to affordable nutritious food, better protection for agricultural workers, better understanding of how food environments influence choices, and perhaps most importantly, better awareness among ordinary people. Because a poor person should not have to be an expert in nutrition, agriculture, toxicology and economics merely to decide what is safe to feed their child. That responsibility cannot be placed entirely on the individual. The food environment itself matters. WHO has explicitly argued that governments have a responsibility to create food environments that make healthier choices easier and more accessible. So perhaps there's another lesson here. We began by asking, can food influence our mind material? The evidence suggests that nutrition certainly matters for physical and brain development. But then we discovered something much bigger. Food is not merely a personal choice. For many people, it is also an economic choice, an agricultural choice, a policy choice, a market choice, a cultural choice, and sometimes a choice constrained by poverty. And that brings us back to the provocative question with which we began. Are we deliberately feeding developing countries a diet that keeps them underdeveloped? I would say, we do not have sufficient evidence to claim a deliberate global conspiracy. But we absolutely have evidence that unequal access to nutritious food, unhealthy food environments, poverty, weak food systems and inadequate protection can contribute to cycles of disadvantage. And that is serious enough. We don't need a conspiracy theory to recognize a real problem. Perhaps our responsibility is to move from conspiracy to inquiry, from blame to understanding, from fear to evidence, and from helplessness to action. So today, look within yourself once again. Ask, what am I feeding my body? Then ask, what am I feeding my mind? And finally ask something even bigger. What kind of mind material are we creating for the next generation? Because perhaps the future of a country is not built only in its parliament. Perhaps it is also built at the dining table, in the classroom, in the farm, in the marketplace, in the neighborhood, and inside the developing mind of every child. I am Dr. Rekha Kale, your success mindset mentor, and this is the mind material within us. Don't simply believe what you hear. Don't simply reject what you hear. Inquire. Look for evidence. Look within. And then decide what you think. Because perhaps the greatest protection against manipulation, whether commercial, social, political or psychological, is a mind that has learned to inquire before believing. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep observing, and keep discovering the mind material within us. Thank you for being with me.